I have Thad, who probably doesn't need an introduction, sitting to my left, and Jordan sitting to my right. But I just want to begin and let them each spend a second introducing themselves and their companies, just so we know the background here. And I'll introduce myself after them. So we'll begin with Jordan.
Thanks, Larry. So as mentioned, Jordan McKee, I'm a research director at 451 Research. We're an IT research and advisory firm, about 120 analysts based in New York, focused on innovation and emerging technologies. I look after a group called Customer Experience and Commerce, and my team effectively looks at the evolution of the shopping journey. So everything from product impression and discovery to sales and marketing, commerce and payments, and service and support. And my particular remit is retail payments. So I focus on the issuers and the acquirers and the value chain that underpins them, and primarily look at them from the standpoint of digital transformation and how they're adapting to new technologies.
Cool, Thad.
Yeah, I'm Thad Peterson. You've already heard about me. I work for IT Group, which is similar to 451. We do just financial services. I'm in the retail banking and payments group, responsible for the merchant side of payments, emerging payment technologies, and mobile.
And I'm Larry Berlin, and I work for First Analysis. We have two roles. One is I do equity research, so I write about the big companies like PayPal, as we just talked about. And at the same time, we do venture capital, and we invest in this space and many others. We're our 13th fund, and the company that you most likely heard of that's runs in our portfolio is TrustWave, which is now in the Singaporean government's portfolio, so not ours. And it was profitable, so which is nice. And I'm going to try, because we're at the end of the sessions and so forth, and near the end, I think we'll probably recap issues and revisit some of the issues of yesterday especially, and get a couple different opinions on it, and try to just hit the bottom lines on them. And actually, I would begin today with one, Thad, not surprising, a topic you just brought up. If we're changing to all the local payments and we're getting rid of the cards and so forth, how does Visa and MasterCard react? Not to mention Discover, American Express, and all the other cards. And what are they going to do?
Okay. You know, one of the interesting things about payments is nothing ever goes away. Nothing in payments has ever gone away since barter. So we're still doing coin, we're still doing barter, we're still doing check, for God's sakes. So you know, these things are going to be around for a long time, and I think what's happening with the networks is that they're desperately trying to find ways to add value beyond just moving transactions around, just like processors are. Moving transactions is a low-value, high-commodity business that takes a lot of energy and a lot of expense, but it doesn't add much value. So they're really trying to find ways to create value within the network, which is creating inherent conflict with their processor and issuer clients.
I would just echo that. I mean, I think to Thad's point, you know, the networks are trying to broaden their value proposition, and they're doing that through a variety of investments and services. So if you look at Visa and the Visa advertising service, right? I mean, effectively what they're doing is leveraging data that they're privy to as a network to help advertisers out with things like attribution and targeting. If you look at Visa Commerce Network, they're effectively trying to link offers between merchants on their network for customers that are using a Visa card. You know, both MasterCard and Visa are investing in P2P payments, right? Visa Direct, MasterCard Send, you know, they're looking for ways to leverage their network creatively. MasterCard in particular, you know, investing very heavily into data and analytics with the acquisition of Applied Predictive Technologies for like $800 million a couple years ago. So they're certainly not sitting on their hands, and I think they see in a lot of ways the data that they still have as networks as, you know, potential inputs into a broader equation that could position them as more than just a mover of you know, bits of transactional data between parties.
And in reality, we had a guy maybe 15 years ago who said to me that in the internet in general, you have, and this goes back to University of Chicago economics, marginal cost equals marginal revenue in the end. And when your marginal cost equals your marginal revenue, that equals zero or near zero, you can't really add any value. And so what both of you, I think, are saying is that they're looking for new ways to add value because they're going to zero. And we've had the term race to zero used a bunch of times yesterday. It sounds like there's a lot of race to zero, and we push on and add value and add consulting, but add everything else. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I mean, there's a race to the bottom in payments, right? I mean, I think there's a realization that interchange, you know, long term isn't going to be a sustainable model in and of itself, and there's going to be a need to add new types of revenue streams that are tied back to value, right? That are about something that's more than just dispatching payments between parties. And so I think that's where you see a lot of the attention and the focus right now in the network space is around trying to latch on to those those new types of revenue streams that could become a support to potentially declining margins on interchange in the future.
Yeah, and in Europe, interchange is mandated in Europe, as we were talking about earlier, at around 20 basis points, I think, for credit and 10 basis points for debit. It's really hard to run a factory at 20 basis points. That's not a lot of money, and you're certainly not going to run a loyalty program like we run around here at 20 basis points. So it dramatically changes the economic model for payments.
How does it change the business model also? I mean, if you can't use loyalty.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things you do is then you sell your data, which is exactly what PSD2 is all about. And so you got to find ways to make money outside of running transactions. And so issuers looking at 20 basis points of value are looking for ways to do that. And banks running that are saying, well, if I can't make any money on card, maybe I'll just do something else like an alternative payment program like NPP in Australia.
And I mean, we haven't talked about Europe at all, really, as much as Asia or U.S. is kind of like the land in the middle. I mean, if you don't have loyalty programs, we're looking at loyalty to adopt mobile, we're looking at added services, and Europe can't have loyalty programs. How do they drive adoption for mobile usage for payment?
And I'd like to hear what Jordan has to say, but I think, they did EMV really quickly and really well, and now they're into contactless. And I think you drive adoption into mobile with contactless. I think that's really the camel's nose in the tent for total mobile adoption. Once like I said yesterday, the behavior shift from putting your card into a POS terminal versus tapping the card on the POS terminal is really, really nominal. And so that's a simple behavior shift. When that happens, I think you'll see mobile really get adopted very quickly.
The thing is, it's a pleasure. For those of you who are staying, I know this hotel has it, but when you go to the door, you don't have to slide your card and get it to work. You just go like that. Or when you get on the CTA to get to O'Hare Airport or Midway Airport, you just tap. Just people learn it.
Yeah.
It gets there. So I would ask you the same question, by the way. I mean, what do you think with Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about Europe right now is obviously the onset of PSD2, which effectively requires banks to open up their infrastructure to third parties. And what I think we'll see over the course of the next 3 to 5 years is retailers getting really aggressive as it relates to their payment strategies. And I think it's pretty easy to imagine a scenario where you have a large merchant like Tesco that has a branded application that allows you to pay in store, to do some tender steering and effectively guide the user's hand to just link up their bank account directly to that application to circumvent Visa and MasterCard, and perhaps they provide them with some small reward for doing so. So that idea of tender steering in a post-PSD2 world, I think, is going to become a pretty significant reality. And so as a result of that, I think you will see retailers getting very aggressive with their own mobile payment strategies, and it's going to put the networks in a tough position, right, to guide them towards platforms like Apple Pay and Google Pay, when you have retailers that can offer really robust value propositions with their own rewards incentives tied into that, and again, sidestepping the networks and connecting right into that bank account.
Do you, and I was talking about this yesterday with somebody, see a big difference in the type of retailer? For example, Macy's behave a lot different than 7-Eleven, and QSRs, which we talked about yesterday a bit, are something totally different, especially compared to sit-down fancy restaurants. I mean, how do you see one leading the charge or one lagging the charge? Or
I mean, I think at least what we've seen in the U.S., right, is quick service restaurants have been very active in this space. Starbucks obviously still the shining example of success, but there have been many that have looked to replicate that model, from Dunkin' Donuts to a whole host of larger quick serve restaurants, even smaller ones in the the 10 to 30 location range, through partners like Level Up, which have effectively given them that platform to build a Starbucks-like experience. So I think quick service, absolutely. And the reason being that there's a frequency of purchase associated with that vertical, where you have customers that are coming in on a fairly regular basis, so you can form some habits. Where it gets a little more challenging is when you get to the retailers like a Macy's, where perhaps you're only going in maybe a couple times a month at best. I think what you'll see there is, very similar to what Kohl's has done, where they've created a mobile experience, tied it to their very successful private label card, and given those high-value customers a means to, have a really engaging mobile experience in store tied back to private label. I don't know that you'll see as much, open loop, Visa, MasterCard type experiences tied into that with the larger, traditional department store type retailers.
And there's a really important thing about the Kohl's model, and that is that the payment is incidental to the transaction. And when you do the Kohl's model, you walk in store, your coupons show up, your Kohl's Bucks show up, all the loyalty stuff shows up on your app. It's all there, and then you go to check out and you can enable the payment. The payment is a component or a subset of a larger vision, which is I want you to be in the store, I want you to buy stuff, and I want you to be happy. And that's a big shift. We tend to think that payments are kind of like the center of the universe, well, they're really not. They're an enabler of commerce.
So yeah, I laugh because I've been drawing that circle, and for 10 years ago, I always put payments as its own circle in the middle of the ecosphere from coming to this conference. And now I listen to Axiom, which is in digital marketing, too much. And I look at the customer experience as being the circle, and payments as just being a little piece of that customer experience. Because it begins with using the data, get me to the store, offer me a coupon, and ends with getting that stuff into my hands or into my girlfriend's ear, if it's earrings, without a problem. So, because that's the most important thing, getting a smile on her face. That's what I'm worried about. I'm not worried about anything else when the process comes. To flip the topic a little bit and to go back, you talked about interchange. And yesterday, Thad and I, Jordan, got to listen to Lyft. And one of the things that came about was the difference in card present and card not present. And in a lot of cases, merchants are being charged card not present for using my phone, in all cases. And just curious what the differences are, and if you could explain them and what do you think is going to happen with them going forward.
Sure. Well, card not present was created with internet and e-commerce because there was no way to really accurately determine if this person who had the card was in fact that person, this account was in fact linked to them. So the level of fraud was dramatically higher in the e-commerce space. And so what the networks did was they charged disproportionately higher interchange fees for card not present versus card present, and that remains to this day. So if I walk into a store, into a Walmart, and I want to buy something with my card there, I would pay dramatically less than if I go onto Walmart.com and use exactly the same card to buy exactly the same thing. It's going to be more expensive. That made sense until basically mobile became more secure than card present. And that's kind of where we are. If you look at an Apple Pay transaction, it's a fully tokenized experience that is as safe or safer than any card-present experience. And one of the things that's really frustrating people is, I can go into Home Depot and I could pick something, I can take a picture of something, I can buy it online while I'm standing in the store with my phone, and it'll be a card-not-present charge versus walking up to the checkout. That's simply absurd. So there's been some conversations about something called a device present model, where, if it's on your device and you can authenticate it that way, then it's going to get a lower rate. But this is one of those aberrations of time and economics that needs to go away.
Yeah, I think, again, to Thad's point, it's becoming a real challenge as some of these mobile and digital experiences start to scale. So you think about a quick service restaurant, 10 years ago, a good chance just about all of their volume was card present. But now as these things like mobile order ahead start to scale, and you have some really large players like Grubhub as a great example, or Postmates, or Uber Eats, well, those are effectively guiding customers' hands into digital channels, and as a result, there are card not present fees associated with those transactions. Same idea with click and collect, right? Where I'm still going to go in the store, right, to acquire that physical product, but it's more convenient for me as a customer to make that purchase online, and I can just pick it up at the service desk. Well, it's a card not present transaction. So as more of these types of kind of omni-channel experiences really start to gain volume, it's a real hit for merchants when it comes to pricing. And as Thad mentioned, I mean, we're getting to a point where the payments ecosystem doesn't have a leg to stand on when you have experiences like Apple Pay that are using biometrics, that are using a tokenized credential that, if compromised, is effectively useless outside of the context of that transaction. How are we still able to charge a higher fee for that type of payment when it's arguably significantly more secure than what we've been doing at the point of sale for many years?
So it's and go back to your theory on MasterCard, Visa, and the cards going away. Does the fact that there is a CNP and a CP card present, does that accelerate the move away from cards? Will the merchants, like from Walmart to Amazon, eventually just look to?
I don't think that they can ever go away from cards because like nothing ever goes away. And,
So my money's here.
yeah, we'll be using cards until we're all dead. That's just the truth. They're not going away. And there'll still be checks out there, believe it or not. But I think it does encourage merchants to think about other alternatives. One of the things that's very interesting is with Costco, they just announced that they're accepting Apple Pay at Costco, but they only accept it on Visa cards because they don't have a deal with MasterCard. They only have a deal with Visa. And so what you're starting to see is merchants kind of flexing their muscles and saying, well, I'm not going to play your game anymore. And I don't have to because I've got enough customers on my own that I can make this happen.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Thad. I mean, I think merchants are going to get increasingly aggressive when it comes to their payment strategies. As a direct result of pricing, they realize that again with digital, with their own mobile applications, they can tender steer with greater ease. They can guide the customer's hand towards a lower cost funding mechanism and reward them, incentivize them to do so. So what you will see is, again, many retailers, and this is happening today already, right? If you look at Uber right now, effectively they will incentivize you with a small amount of Uber credits to move funds from your bank account into a stored value account within Uber. Amazon is doing that today, moving funds from your checking account into a stored value account. They'll incentivize you to do so. So you'll see more creative strategies coming into the space as a direct result of this contention over pricing around card payments.
Cool. Let me flip over back a little bit. Security, and I was asking you guys before this. Does security? I mean, we talked about it yesterday. We talked about the day before, and it sounds like an essential thing for everyone. But as a consumer, I don't give to, because I'm not indemnified. I don't have to worry about it. I'm indemnified. As we move to mobile, it shouldn't matter because everything's tokenized and biometricized and things like that. Why are we still talking about it? And is it just a random number on a survey, or is it something more?
I think it's a fixed cost.
Okay.
I think security is going to be a problem forever, and the fraud's going to be a problem forever, and the war is going to go on, and there's going to be companies that spend a lot of time and a lot of money protecting that and keeping it going. But the fact of the matter is, we're never going to win the war. It's always going to be there. It just depends on what the rate is for the type of the transaction. And I think that the best way for a merchant to manage it, or a network or an issuer, is to say, this is a cost of doing business. I want to keep it under control, but it's always going to be there. From a consumer perspective, they don't care.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And what's interesting, about digital, and obviously there's all this concern with more fraud moving into digital channels as a result of, at least some would argue, EMV kind of squeezing the bubble, counterfeits going down at the point of sale. And the argument is that fraudsters are migrating into digital channels as a result of that. But I think what's interesting is that digital commerce affords us to implement so many different types of fraud prevention mechanisms that we never had available in the physical world, right? If you think about things like behavioral biometrics, where you've got vendors like Biosec and Behavio Catch that effectively are looking at your behavior on that device, right? Are you copying and pasting a lot of data? Well, that kind of looks like maybe you purchased a data dump on the dark web, right? And now you're trying to test those credentials. Are you holding your device differently than you have over those past 100 interactions that I've had with you as a customer? So there's inputs like that can be put into a broader risk equation. Device identity, right? Is that device been associated with fraudulent transactions in the past? Does it mirror some of the attributes that we've seen with devices that have executed fraudulent transactions? So again, I think what's exciting about digital, yes, there's concerns, but there are so many new inputs we can kind of incorporate into a risk equation that creates something that's much more robust than we've ever had at the point of sale.
Yep. And on the flip side, we don't talk much about lending, but on the consumer lending side, there's a company called Upstart out there that is basically a bunch of ex-Googlers who have created a consumer lending model that basically doesn't look at FICO, doesn't look at the traditional credit scoring models at all. They've created their own model because they're using AI and deep learning to figure out what really matters in terms of when people pay back loans. And one of the things they discovered is that whether or not you're employed isn't as relevant as where you're employed. So what they're doing is building an entirely different credit approval model based on real behavior and artificial intelligence, and it's a really interesting idea. I encourage you to take a look at it.
Does that mean Goldman Sachs employees are less likely to pay than Morgan Stanley employees?
Probably so.
Probably so. One goes to government for jobs efforts. Yeah, I see.
Sorry, what was the name of that company?
Upstart. Yeah.
But if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand as we go along. So please.
Yeah.
I guess the UK is under the 20 basis points regulation from the EU. Do you think they will there will be a move to raise interchange in the UK after they leave? Or is the genie out of
Do you think Tesco would accept that? Or Sainsbury? I mean, I think the genie's out of the bottle at that point. What's the rationale to raise it? Well, we were regulated, and so now we're going to go back to where we were, I don't know. What do you think, Jordan?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Typically you can raise things, but putting them back, you can lower things, I should say, but putting them in the other direction is a very challenging task. So I think if anything, we'll continue to see it move lower and lower and lower. I don't think there's a leg to stand on to push rates back up.
And another part of that in the UK is, Tesco and Sainsbury have very, very robust loyalty programs on their own. And they, loyalty in the UK is all about the retailer. It's not about the issuer. So it's a very different model.
It's interesting. So we'll flip a little bit again. The point of sale device, and we talked a lot about that yesterday also. Does it have a future, or is it an irrelevancy? And I guess that's a good way to finish the question.
Yeah, well, I think the hardware itself is dumb. It's the intelligence, it's the software, it's the services that you build around it, and that's the exact reason why Verifone and Ingenico are going through a fairly transformative time in their evolution, where they've realized that there's not a ton of value that can be extracted out of the physical piece of hardware. But if you do things like build application ecosystems around the point of sale that a merchant can now go into and kind of integrate with their point of sale environment, well, that starts to become a little more compelling. If you wrap an estate management service around a fleet of point of sale devices that allows me as the business owner to understand where all my devices are in the field, that starts to become a little more compelling. But point being that all of this stuff is moving into the cloud. It's about the cloud connected services and ecosystem that you're building around that piece of hardware that rests on the counter, which doesn't have a whole lot of intelligence or value baked into it.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and then I would add, and this is what brought up the question, I go to Sam's Club, and actually on this panel 2 years ago, Sears of all companies brought it up, that they thought that they were going to be able to go to systems where no longer do I go in a Sears store, go to a point of sale, and have some employee there like this keying me in. They wanted that employee selling me stuff. They wanted that employee echoing or imitating what's now becoming Siri rapidly, selling me stuff. They don't want the person keying it in. And I go to Sam's Club, and guess what? I scan my tag, I put in a shopping cart, I click a button, I walk out, and I skip a 40-person line, always at a Sam's Club. And I look at that personally as being a future, not a replacement in the near future, but something that will happen going forwards. One of the other things from yesterday, and the flip topic's entirely here, someone brought up the topic that the FIs were not part of the conversation, and the banks and so forth. We really didn't talk about them much yesterday. Do you guys have any thoughts on banks besides the people who used to own Visa and MasterCard?
Yeah.
What their role's going to be going forwards?
Well, banks are an interesting model. I mean, we were speaking the other day about the fact that the overall cost of payments is spread out across a lot of different groups. If you look at the B2B space, it's generally in the treasury or commercial banking side. Cards are, if you've ever worked at a bank, the card silo is a different animal, and the bankers don't like card people, and the card people don't like bankers.
Yeah.
Okay, and the reason is because bankers don't like risk. You don't go into banking if you're a risk kind of guy, okay? Card people are all about risk. They manage risk for a living. And so they're very, very different. And it's a real legitimate struggle to get Treasury to talk to card and look at the company holistically. And I think they're going to have to, because with open banking and the emergence of fintech charters and stuff like that, they're going to be getting some serious competition from organizations that really don't care about their vision of the world with treasury and card.
Yeah, I think to take it in a somewhat different direction, the interesting thing to watch in banking over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be around identity. And there's a number of interesting things that are happening today, but effectively the argument is that as a financial institution, I have competencies in risk, I have competencies in KYC, I have competencies in ID and V, and I can use that to effectively be a broker of identity for the customer that's doing business with me. And Capital One is kind of marching down that path today in the U.S. There's stuff going on in Canada, which is very fascinating with all the large banks. In Europe, there's a bunch of different initiatives, Barclays and gov.uk, where effectively the bank is again serving as this broker of digital identity, because at the end of the day, their competency is in risk and verification, and they're more or less productizing that as a digital service. I think that's going to be a really interesting avenue for financial institutions to attempt to march down as we push over the next 5 or so years.
Any further questions? Yes. Yeah, please. Please, Bob.
Yeah, Larry, in very networking from this project, Visa and MasterCard, of course, have still electronics on Wall Street. So are they not so good long-term investment?
You're the investor guy, go.
All yours.
In asking these questions is because I've been debating that, to be honest. They've had stellar, I have a theory that every company, from Facebook and Amazon to Visa and MasterCard to McDonald's, in growing, creates the seeds of their own destruction. And I'll say destruction is the wrong word. It's basically being brought back to the mean rather than destruction. And I suspect that Visa and MasterCard have, over the years, created their own methods, and someone will bring them back to the mean. And as these two gentlemen have pointed out, the opening up of the networks, huge. It's kind of like the democratization, I think was kind of what you're getting to, which everyone used last year as a buzzword, spreads to this channel. And then my question, which came into my head after that, Alliance Data, for those of you who know it, run the private label cards. So Synchrony runs it for Target, Alliance Data runs it from Crate & Barrel, Victoria's Secret, and 130 other chains. Do they become even more important going forwards, because they're going to work with the merchant, whereas Visa and MasterCard are stuck working with no one. And then you get stuck with Discover and American Express, and Discover is on its own plane, but Discover, the card's a fuel, but it's a bank. And what do? So you get to a whole question. I can't give a recommendation because the SEC would kill me, but you ask a good question.
Yeah, and that being said, the other side of it is that annuitized revenue is always a beautiful thing as an investor, and cards aren't going away. We're going to have 4% growth on the base that's Visa and MasterCard at this point in time is a beautiful thing. So they're going to be making money for the foreseeable future. Whether or not they make as much as they are now is a question mark.
And David, I see you back there.
Yeah, I'm just curious what you guys think on the scale side of consumer adoption. None of this matters. Consumers aren't going to switch over to using their phones or in-app payments, whatever it might be. And those of us in payments probably run into this all the time. A lot of our friends and our spouses don't know about this, and don't care, When I'm in a store, I'll say, hey, that's a Verifone card, and it's a terminal. I'm like, what?
Yeah, they don't know how cool it is.
I'm just wondering if regular masses will ever catch on to this stuff. And it comes to your point that you said they contact this card to get us in that habit. Do you think it would be more by osmosis than it will actually be a decision or a incentive to do it?
Well, in my mind, there's two things that change behavior. One is there's enough value proposition to change behavior. ATMs are the best example of that I can ever think of. When before ATMs, you had to go to the supermarket to get money, and ATMs were immediately adopted. The other side of it is that friction goes away. One of those two things has to happen to change behavior. The value proposition piece for mobile wallets isn't there, frankly. It isn't there yet, unless you go into a Kohl's model. But the frictionless side of it, I think, will emerge, partly because of contactless, partly because my daughter never has her phone out of her hand. ever, okay? And, you know, we can talk millennials, but it's not just millennials. There's a whole generation of people who pretty much always have their phone there. For them, it's more convenient to do this than it is to reach into the wallet and pull out a card. That behavior shift, I think, will happen. It's just not going to happen real quickly. That's in my opinion.
Oh, all right. I can
Yeah.
get one last one in. So I just wanted to wrap a little bit of market data around that that we've collected. So in the U.S. Last year, mobile contactless payments, according to our forecast, accounted for 1.1% of in-store point-of-sale volume. So that's about 1 out of every 100 transactions. We're not anticipating a ton of growth there by 2022. We think it's going to be about 3.5%. So again, still just a drop in the ocean. And you know, to Thad's point, it's about evolving the value proposition. When you have something that works very well today, which are cards, you need something that's measurably better to move from the early adopter category into the mainstream user category. And still today, that value proposition remains very nascent, and it's going to require more inputs to broaden that out to appeal to the average customer.
As we walk off and leave the stage to Greg, one last quick thing. Yesterday, somebody said that every year we have a nice recurring revenue model. We get to show up and just replace the year for this year of mobile payments. Will we ever hit a point where this recurring revenue or recurring conference model ends? And do you have a prediction of what year that happens so I can go find something else to do at the end of August? So,
I don't know. I think we'll be saying 10 years, 20 years from now.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, you know, we need to get past saying this is the year of mobile payments because we've said it since about 2010.
Yeah.
It's going to be a much longer runway.
so Ed and Marla, you got a recurring revenue model. Thanks,
Yep.
guys, for coming and
Thank you very
joining me. Thanks, everyone, for being here.